Okay, let's talk about kicks, first and foremost. Kick is the main fundamental of a drum. If you don't know what a kick is, what are you doing? It sounds like that, or that, or that, or that, or that, or that, or that. We're going to be synthesizing a kick from scratch, and I am going to show you the basic version of just utilizing the E-kick, and then talking about shaping it, kind of utilizing some of the tools that we just went over. But keep in mind, while it is good and very important to be able to synthesize your own kicks and stuff, you can always start with a sample and do the same kind of processing and whatnot that I normally would. So in regards to the E-kick, we've got pretty much two different things. We have the body of the kick, which I'm starting with this for a reason, so hold on one sec. We have the body of the kick, which is the sine wave part. The boom, boom. The tail of the kick, which is that tail. Usually the kicks are not that long, but I guess you can make them. And then we also have this thing that's called a click, which is the transient. We can also manipulate the transient of this by having a pitch mod on here. So that's a little bit more identifiable. Now, for me, I generally make things that are in the world of hip hop kicks. And when it comes into that, they're usually very knockish. And before I go any further, I do kind of want to talk about how to understand what we're trying to control. So if I pull up an EQ, I'm going to show you on a Pro Q just because it's a cleaner interface, but you can just use the EQ Plus for this. But what is going on here is we have the transient, which is going to be somewhere up in this region. Actually, that's all the way here. So if we just listen to the transient part, right, that's the top end. Over here, we have the 100-ish range, which is going to control the knock of the sound. So you hear that. Then we have the fundamental, which is the lowest frequency, basically the bass of the kick. Anything in between, like 200 to 1K, this is actually going to control what you would call the boxiness of a kick. And the boxiness just kind of makes it sound, well, boxy, I guess, but it is important to kind of understand what that sounds like whenever we listen to this. So I'm going to kind of focus more. Generally speaking, we usually don't need that information. You don't have to go so far as to be like womp, but you can. And most of the time what I do whenever I'm shaping kicks is I'll cut the high end off, just to be very frank. And then what I'll do is I'll usually boost the low end or something and then play around with the relationship between the first harmonic and whatever we have going on here. So with that being said, you can utilize that to kind of to your advantage when it comes into actually just EQing, say like a regular kick or something, into kind of trying to work it towards what you want it to sound like. But because we have some synthesis options, we can kind of get a little bit closer instead and find something that's going to be more useful, and then go into the EQing and stuff and figure out what we want to do along with the rest of the processing. So first and foremost, whenever I'm working with drums, the first thing that I do is this. And the reason why is because no matter what I do in between, if I just leave this here, then it's going to be a lot easier for me to kind of manipulate. It's also going to hopefully give us a layer. It's not a total 100%, but it will give us a layer of protection in case if we accidentally experiment a little bit too hard, right? So anyways, if we take a listen to this, then that's actually not terrible, because what we have is a really strong transient of this. But now what we can do is adjust the decay of this. And you can see that we've got that Dorito chip that's going on there. Now from here, there's actually a lot that we can do in order to kind of start shaping this. But when it comes into actually like, oh, well, how do we make this fat? That's when we get into the effect processing of here. And believe it or not, we don't actually have to do much. We can pull up a filter plus. And the first thing that I'm going to do is actually pull this up here, and I'm going to reduce this to about 400 hertz. And it's going to sound like this. Because now with that 400 hertz cut, along with a little bit of resonance, you can kind of hear that it's starting to sound a little bit more of like a knock, right? And so now we can start to utilize the push, which when it comes into drums, these two here, these soft clipper with a detailed curve, S-shaper clipper, these two are usually the best. I would say experiment with all of them, depending on what you're going for. One thing I'll say is if you're trying to make like hardstyle kicks and stuff, then sometimes using a Chevy can give you like wild results. And then combining that and like stacking that and stuff can give you some crazy stuff. Okay, that's no longer a kick, that's more of a laser. But anyways, I just wanted to cover that. But generally speaking, whenever I go for the kinds of kicks that I like, I start to turn off the anti-aliasing for one and push this until it starts to break. So now, one thing that you want to be mindful of whenever you're doing this kind of stuff is sometimes if you have too much distortion, it's going to make and reinforce the tail of this. So if you listen to this now, it's a lot longer. So what we can do is back off of the decay. And then what we can do is start to look at maybe utilizing some general compression, kind of like so. And we're going to use this to bump it and try to make it go shbink. I don't know, sound effects are optional. So within the compressor here, one thing that I want to talk about is kind of experimenting with the different textures that we have. So we have vanilla, smooth, overglue, resist, smash, and these all have a different explanation about like what it's trying to change. But I find that depending on what it is that you're using, you're going to kind of have to just mess with this because I have not found a sense of consistency whenever it comes to different sounds. But let's go ahead and maybe try over. If we want to, we can use auto timing, which it will try to guess what the sound is for us. So that seems to have made it a little bit fatter. Maybe we can reduce the threshold here. Let's try playing with the attack. And all I'm really trying to do here is just make it louder and make it fatter. One thing I will say is that the prism is usually more useful when it comes into making drum sounds, just because these other ones, as you can see, low bump, reduced highs on compression, mid-range bump. I guess you can try a transistor, play with them. But generally speaking, I usually just go for the prism. It doesn't really matter at this point. It's, as you can see, it's not really doing much for us. We can try to utilize a lift here with the bottom end to where we're doing what's called upwards compression. And we broke it. But this did give us just a little bit more out of this. So and depending on what you're going for me, this is just a very simple fundamental. It's not the most, elaborate thing. And it's important to talk about this because this is literally just a kick, from the most basic approach of sounds that you could possibly get to. This is a great fundamental. I would still find other stuff to put under it, but you can definitely use it. We can turn on the makeup here if we want to and start to drag this down and clip it even more. We can also back off of the lift here and then adjust this. So in order to make this louder and more like fat, you want to make sure that you turn the makeup on and then reduce this. And by utilizing those, you can kind of mess around and start to play with the different timbres and kind of texture in a little bit of a different way. And I'm going to show you something cool here in a second, but keeping in mind, going back to this, we can start to kind of change how we want this kick to be expressed. So that's pretty much flabby now. So having some kind of pitch mod on here can be super useful. Now, I kind of just wanted to do that with you because you can see, like, by utilizing this, we're getting lots of different sounds. And that's really important to kind of talk about because depending on what you're doing, you know, when it comes into synthesized kicks, are you going for a techno kick? Are you going for a hip hop kick? Are you going for a side trance kick? Are you just going for an 808? Maybe it might make sense to do that. Right? But having the control of all of these is a really good introduction to just being like, what am I doing with these drums? That being said, there are a lot of other options that we can explore. And one thing that we can do to really take this into like a different world is to add some instance of physicality to this. And this is something that you'll see me do with a lot of different drums. Especially in like the final stages of the design when I'm ready to start implementing this within an actual track. But because this is literally a sine wave and a click, which is just a really tiny piece of white noise, we don't have much to work with. And that's why this kick sounds so basic. It's cool, don't get me wrong, but there's not much else to this. And that's a lot of times why maybe your drums don't sound interesting unless if you're going for something very digital specifically, which there's nothing wrong with. But in terms of halftime, like part of what makes it so cool is the texture, or drum and bass or something. So what's very typical that some people would do is they would, I guess the easiest thing is if we group this, we hadn't talked about samplers yet, but we can briefly, is you can utilize something like a sampler and you can layer this with a kick. Something like so. And we can take away the attack on here by utilizing the envelope. So this would just mean that this is going to creep in. You can see that just by utilizing that, we've created a little bit more texture over the top. That's cool, but that's kind of boring. Something that you might want to try instead is like some weird Foley or something. Doesn't really matter what it is. Sure. And let's go ahead and move this down. But you can see like now we're getting into means of creating texture over this that is going to be a little bit easier and a little bit more interesting to work with. Now the reason why this sounds so subdued is, if you recall, we are actually putting this over here. And the last thing that I want to talk about is the optional thing when it comes into shaping this, which I personally prefer to use the fuse compressor. But let's go over some options, which for one, I'll just show you this is what I use. Again, we'll go over a few different things here. And for the rest of this series, you'll most likely see me pull this one up, so that way I don't have to do this on every video. But if we were to talk about OTT, it can help bring back some of the high end. So long attack, long release, basically all of these knobs go up to your liking, to your taste. I know that we didn't really talk about multi-band compression, but it's basically compression on several different frequency ranges. So from low to high, you can see that this is, if I use this crossover, 80 hertz to 320 to 1000 to 2500 to 8000. Long story short. But anyways, it's going to sound like this. And now suddenly it's like, whoa, what just happened? That was like magic, right? Well, what's happening is we're utilizing more upwards compression to pull out that high end that we took back. And that's how you can kind of get some cool, different, aspects of sounding. That's not to say that you need OTT or you need like a multi-band compressor to get this kind of thing. You can just back off of this if you want to. So I just prefer the sound that I get out of the multi-band compression when it comes into kicks to get that kind of characteristic that I like. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense, but you can do a lot of this stuff just with general EQ. Now, with that being said, if we didn't want to do filtering, let's say we left this here, turn the resonance down, we can get a finer means of control, which can sometimes be useful. So if I use an EQ5, I can take a look at this and maybe I want to cut off some of the top end. So then we can actually utilize some of this stuff to shape it. So if I want to boost the low end, maybe pull that knocking stuff around that 100 hertz. See how that changes a lot? It's really interesting, actually. Maybe I want to reduce this. But you can see, like, there's not really a right or wrong. It's more so about being aware of what you're going for and what sounds good to you. But the big thing is, does it have a transient? Yes. Does it have a presence of where it's like a thump? That's probably the most important thing when it comes into a kick, is does it thump? Yes. After that, it's kind of free game into what you want to do. And to be honest with you, when it comes into all this stuff, like, you don't just have to use a single instance of this. You can use multiple instances to try to, like, make a weird amalgamation. The other thing that I think is really important to talk about when it comes into drum design, especially with kicks, is that if you are going for something like a gabber kick, which is like just a dwank or something like that, then having really interesting and, like, very strange curves, kind of like this on multiple levels, kind of like so, will give you very strange sounds. So, see? So if you're trying to go for that, like, cool industrial texture thing, or you're trying to go for that weird gabber style kick, this would be something that you can implement. Or what we can even do is move this before the distortion. Let's go back to that Chevy. Playing around with different distortion modes, obviously. Yeah, so that's a rabbit hole, but keeping in mind of playing with different distortion shapes and sometimes doing stuff in between, to where you might even go EQ, distortion, EQ, distortion. Maybe different types of distortion. That's pretty cool. Maybe we can use the transfer here to where we can create our own curve. I'll just right click and go reset. Maybe do something kind of like so. Then maybe we can do something kind of like this. Now what happens if we add a bigger pitch bend? That's cool. Yeah, so lots of cool stuff regarding that. Let's go ahead and take quite a few steps back. And what I want to talk about with some other kick stuff, because this is all relevant about processing, is we're going to go back to the filter here. Something that's really important, which is other ways to cultivate texture within this. There we go. Now, let's say you don't want to do this. Something that you can also consider is making this into a stereo signal to some extent, because if you look here, this is all in mono. It does not have any blue whatsoever, even though this is a blue line. But yeah, it has zero interesting stereo stuff happening to it. And so if I were to do something like this mid side, which is a way that we can add stereo, you'll notice that even if I turn this up, which is the side signal, there's nothing happening. And that's because we have zero side signal whatsoever. So in order to do that, we have to put something in here that's going to give us a little bit of that. So the easiest answer, like I had talked about in the last video, would be convolution. So one thing that we can do is set this to 100% and group it, and then create a layer 2 to where the convolution is here. Then we can put anything in here. Generally a room is going to be good. You can see that on a lot of these samples here, you can look at how long these tails are. So this is a good one. Anything works, guys. Anything works. It's about how it sounds. Just listen to it. But if we solo this, we actually have side signal now. And we can turn that up. But what's happening now is from boosting that side signal, we've actually created a space in this now. Now, you might have to be careful because this is already baked into this, but if you look at what's going to happen, you see that this is all side information, so this could interrupt some of the phase. But a very easy fix for that would be to go into that side signal and just cut out the low end. So now, whenever we go back to our kick of the mid signal, it's got a little bit of texture now. And because we can just focus on the side information, we can do lots of different stuff like add distortion. We can use stuff like the frequency shifter to kind of play around with the different, how do you say, the different texture, the tone of the texture, I guess, if you will. Maybe I can move this beforehand. That was the Nike commercial that was in Scary Movie 2. Don't. No, just kidding. So, yeah, you could go crazy with this and do lots of different stuff with playing around. You can use something like a bit crusher, which I did not cover, but this is more of like a special use case. Sorry, not this one. It would be called 8-bit. Bit 8, rather. And we can kind of just mess with this to create like really crunchy sides. So if we move the clock down and turn the gate up, sorry, move the gate down rather. Then we can kind of play with the settings here to kind of find a nice middle ground in between. Let's set this to something like diffusion. But you can see that we've created some interesting texture on top of this, and then what we can do is go back and just adjust this to where most of the signal is going to still stay in mono. And then we can continue to process the rest of the sound. Sorry, I know I'm jumping a lot. Let me close that. We can continue to process the rest of the sound as we usually would. You don't have to use a convolution. You can use other stuff, but we need something in general to create just a little bit of stereo for us. Something that I find myself doing the most of actually is utilizing a tiny amount of chorus, like a tiny amount, like this much. So that way the difference between this signal is going to be negligible. And then I'll go and start to apply the different texture stuff on the side. Because sometimes, as you'll hear, it creates different and more usable and more like, I guess, harmonization, synchronization, a better symbiotic relationship with how it actually sounds versus it just sounding like a bunch of weird stuff is happening on the side. But remember that it's subjective, and so this is just one way that you can solve that. The other thing that you could always do is you could resample this, take out the low end, and then just like process the top signal to heck, or you can create another instance of this to where, actually, sorry, what we would rather do is go here, and then on this kick, we can create an effect layer, kind of like so, and then we can kind of just go crazy with one of the top chains. Maybe this can be something like dry. This one can be weird. And we can literally just create anything out of this that we want to. So, you know, we can go like super ham with distortion, with amp, with all different kinds of crazy stuff. Now, I will say like, hey, turn it down. You know what I mean? So even with this, we might want to turn the wet gain down or something, and maybe just like try any kind of effect or whatever and just be like, what does this sound like? But with this and these weird effects and stuff, you know, and having that as a use case, we can kind of texturize the tops of our kicks with this and not really have to worry about what's happening on the low end because we've got a very clean signal that we can later mix in. But literally the name of the game is to try to separate the low end from the high end in a lot of different ways, or at least the mids and the sides. And then from there, we can kind of turn the kick into any kind of shape that we actually want to. So in the next video, I think that we're going to do this again, but I'm going to show you how I actually get more control out of utilizing Polymer, because I think that Polymer is a much more sophisticated thing. And we're basically going to recreate a VST that's a lot of people love called Kick 2. And we're going to talk about actually getting more in depth with shaping better kicks.